Evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the July 23rd, 2019 City Council meeting. And the first order of business is roll call.
Bartlett.
Here.
Boersma.
Here.
Caravello.
Here.
Doom.
Here.
Hiley.
Here.
Hirsch.
Here.
Jensen.
Here.
Legaki.
Here.
Majewski.
Here.
Reeves.
Here.
Riley.
Present.
Schumacher.
Here.
There are 12 alders present.
Excellent. Thank you, Holly. The first item of business on here is we're going to have a presentation from Executive Parisi. He's going to come up to the podium and he's going to talk to us about water issues tonight. Welcome to Stoughton again.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate you giving me a few minutes to chat with you tonight. I wanted to give you a little overview of the flooding issues that began last year and some of the work county staff has done and some of the issues we've identified and some of the actions that we're taking to mitigate and work to prevent future flooding. Kind of the background on this is, as we experienced last year and we've been experiencing the last couple of years, we're having rain events that we just didn't used to have. We're having more rain events, more frequent, and much more rain all at once than used to happen. And by all indications, it's going to become more of the norm. When you add to that the fact that our community is a fast-growing community, our population of Dane County has doubled in my lifetime, and with that, we all need places to live and work and shop, and with the development that's gone on, there's more impervious surface. And our storm sewer system is designed throughout the county to take every drop of water that hits on the ground and deliver it to the lakes as quickly as possible. So when you put all that together, and then you experience in the north end of the watershed, like we did last year, 15-inch, one rain event with 15 inches followed by weeks and weeks of rain, it's a recipe for what we saw. And when the rain hits in the North Mendota watershed, in Middleton, Wanakee, Springfield, it ultimately affects everyone down through Stoughton and beyond. So what we've done on the county level is looked at a number of things that we can do. There are some quick things we could do. We, as you know, last year during the floods, we deployed all of our weed cutters to the Ohio River to get water out of Kaganza faster, and by doing the weed cutting there, we were able to double the flow out during the crisis. We've added a couple more weed cutters to our fleet this year, and you may have noticed all of them initially this summer were down there cutting weeds, and we're caught up. We've got that about as good as we can get it. We still have, I believe, about 5 down there, but now we're doing weed cutting throughout the chain of lakes. We've also invested in some more emergency equipment, boats and things that the Sheriff's Department felt we would need as far as first responding. Then we're also looking at what we can do to keep more water on the ground when it hits, so it doesn't all rush into the lakes as quickly. Now, what's done is done, and we can't stop what's going in now for the most part, but we are looking at, we created a fund to look at doing 2 things: to identify wetlands and prairie and areas that can hold water, that are available, that we can purchase and preserve so they don't get developed, so they can hold the water when it falls. And then we're looking at areas where we can do restoration, wetland restoration and prairie restoration. This summer we bought a parcel in Middleton, a 160-acre parcel that is currently a farm that's actually located right over where a stream that feeds into Lake Mendota bubbles up out of the ground, and we're purchasing that, and we're going to restore the wetland where the barnyard is now, and then we're going to convert what was the farm to prairie, and so that we believe not only will be good for water quality, but it'll give us over 2 million gallons net of extra storage of water during a rain. So we're doing that when we can. But what we've also found is that the biggest challenge that we had last year, again, was with flow. It was moving the water through the chain of lakes. And what we see is that over the years in the different areas, and we're trying to figure out if we could leave it up here, maybe if that would be okay just to estimate. We're hoping that the camera can get that. when we look at the different areas where the water flows between the chain of lakes, over the years, they've been clogged up with sediment mostly from urban runoff. It's a lot of sand and things like that in that. So that our biggest challenge last year, again, was moving the water through the system as quickly as possible. So while we were down here cutting weeds, we look up here between Lake Monona and Wabisa, and there's no lock, there's no dam, there's no physical structure there, but there's a 5 or 6 inch difference in, I guess it would be this way, in the depth of the water, and the water slows to a crawl here because it's just clogged with sediment. And so what we've identified is a plan to go in, and we're going to be beginning this September. We're doing the permitting and contracting right now to dredge these channels so that we can move water through more quickly. And we're going to begin here this fall in phase 1, so we can get that water out of Lake Monona where that has, particular flooding issues. And then next year, we'll be doing phase 2. So this is Upper Mud Lake, this is Lower Mud, and then down here, so we can obviously, when it comes in, so we can get it out of Kaganza. And then you can see on the chart where we're looking at doing the other phases. And what this will do, so we look at the areas where we're doing the restoration and preservation to keep the water where it falls more adequately, but then really moving that water through the system. There's a lot of talk about lake levels and what they should be, and that's something that the DNR will decide, particularly for Mendota right now. But really the lake level issue is kind of a moot point when you can't control the levels. We had the Tenny dams, for example, were open full bore for over a year before we got those rains, and we couldn't even get Mendota down to its summer maximum level. So this is the kind of critical point we're at now, and hopefully what we hope to do is, again, phase 2 next year. And the only reason we're not doing phase 2 this year, because you might wonder because it's further down the chain, is because of the work that needs to be done with engineering and testing, because we want to make sure we're not going to be stirring up any contaminants and that sort of thing and have unintended consequences to it. So that we wouldn't have been able to do this year. So that's slated for next year, and we're heading this again because of Monona, but also because that's an area we could get into this year with the technology that we had and get there quickly. We may be able to do, depending on funding, if the City of Madison decides that they have funds to help us out, we may even be able to tackle that, which is listed as phase 5 next year. But it all depends on the funding. So hopefully within the next few years, people used to pray for rain, now we pray for no rain, and I'm loving the forecast we have for at least the next 10 days. If we can avoid a situation like we did last year, we should see some fairly rapid improvement over the next few years. And that's pretty much the presentation I had. I just wanted to, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but again, something that kind of got lost in the discussion during the events was the issue of flow. And this is something we have a much better understanding of now. And this is our plan to tackle it. Yeah.
Is there money from any other sources to fund this, like from foundations or from the state?
We're always looking for that. Right now, we're going ahead and doing it with county dollars. Like I said, we're hoping the City of Madison might be able to pitch in there, but as of now, it's just the county, but we'll continue to obviously look for, we're obviously open.
Is the state open?
Yeah.
Is the state open to giving any money at all?
They've been giving us, I don't know is the answer, they've been giving us a lot of help with their scientists and the DNR, and they've been incredibly helpful in the permitting process because there's, all the, safeguards that we have to go through to ensure. But we'll continue to look into that, and if anyone has any, suggestions and ideas or tips, we're definitely ready to.
Go ahead, Brett.
With the, obviously the weed cutting is going to be an annual event.
Oh, yeah,
on that
ongoing,
sort
you
of
bet.
thing. Have you noticed, has there been an increase or decrease in that weed density based on the prohibition of having the fertilizers from runoff and that over time, about 10, 15 years ago, and it was more and more prohibited of
Yeah.
putting that into the
I
water.
don't know about that specific area, but what we're dealing with kind of in the overall nutrient load is that's a piece of what we have to do, and there's also all of the work that we're doing with agriculture in Dane County, with the partnerships we have to reduce ag runoff, and that's, as you know, that's a huge effort that's
Right.
bearing fruit. And another thing that we're doing, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'll just try to briefly, is that I know some of you are aware of this. This year, we're entering the second year of our project called Suck the Muck. And what that is that's looking at all the nutrients that are already in the streams that feed into the chain of lakes from decades and decades and decades of runoff. It has something we call legacy phosphorus in it. It's sediment. So we're going in and hydraulically dredging our second stretch this year, and that gets a lot of that phosphorus that's in the water already out. So basically, the urban stuff we're doing, the urban projects we're doing, the farm projects and the partnerships we have there, and then our Suck the Muck is our main thrust right now with dealing with the nutrient load.
Is there a website that you have that just generally kind of to follow along through this process for?
Through this one or through the
this
other
one
piece?
or any of the other pieces?
Yeah, I
guess?
I can get that to you, because our Land and Water Resources Department does have information on all this stuff, so.
Okay.
I'll follow up with that.
Everybody here knows that I'll ask 1,000 water questions.
Yeah, that's great, that's great.
Yeah,
I can just forward that to the whole council if you want.
Yeah,
That'd be
that'd be great.
Yeah.
I think Alderperson Bartlett had a question too.
You mentioned sediment testing. Are you testing all the phases? What 2, 3, and the other ones to the south?
Yeah.
Is there money allocated for cleanup if you do encounter something, or we'd be looking for that money?
Right, well,
if-
then we don't know if we encounter something, what that would entail, so we'd have to kind of put on the brakes then and do an assessment. And sometimes the thing to do is to not touch it at all, so we'd have to cross that bridge when we come to it. So far, we've been lucky, with the Suck the Muck too, because we do the same thing with that, because we don't want to accidentally stir things up.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions?
100.
Go ahead, Sid.
Just want to have one follow-up, and that, I did Red Cross work throughout the county this last
Mhm.
year for the disaster, where it was actually a
Yeah.
disaster, and a couple of the cities to the west. And they seem to have the same issues, and we're focusing on this, but there were a lot of complaints about how runoff was, I mean, it was a terrible rainstorm.
Yeah.
last year.
Yeah.
And it affected Madison, and it affected our communities as
Yeah.
well. But in the west part of the county, they're kind of crying for help too, I think.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I mean, the thing that got, after everything got going, what got the most attention was lake levels, but as you're saying, the most damage and the loss of life happened from flash flooding. You know, if you look at Mazo and Cross Plains and Middleton and west side of Madison, that was the real, the most damage actually occurred from that.
Anybody else have any questions? All right, hearing none, thank you very much.
Thanks for your
You're
time.
always welcome to
Appreciate
come
it.
back to Stoughton.
Thanks, you bet.
Okay, next item would be communications. Does any council members have communications? And I'll just remind you to speak into your microphone so those at home can hear you. Alderperson Hirsch?
Yes, I just want to seriously invite all the council members and community to come to the Stones Redevelopment Authority meeting on the Riverfront project. The concept plan, which is Wednesday, August 7th at 6:30 p.m. at the Fire Department Training Room on 401 East Main, and it begins at 6:30. This presentation is inviting our proposed master developer of the site, Kurt Brink, and he's going to go over their concept plan, not the plan. You know, we haven't officially accepted his proposal or anything, but he is going to present their concept plan for the site, and to really start, what we really want to do is get, community involvement tell us what you like or don't like about, his concept plan, and, see what the RDA has in store and what our timeline is and all that for that site. And we're really excited about it, and we want you to be excited too and give us your feedback. So that's August 7th, Wednesday, August 7th at 6:30. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other communications? Director Shield?
At the Public Works Committee meeting earlier this week, we solidified the open house date that we're planning to have related to the Jefferson Street pedestrian bridge, discussing the options for that bridge with the community. That will be held on Wednesday, August 21st at 6 p.m. in the Fire Department Training Room. There actually will be a notice placed on the bridge so that people that are using that pedestrian facility will also be made aware of it in that form. It'll be posted on the website, and a notice will be distributed. So share that with your constituents.
Thank you. Alders, any other communications? And I have a quick one, and then I know Jill has a communications as well. And mine is basically, I just wanted to thank the crew from Stoughton Utilities that headed north to help those up in Wisconsin Rapids with all the storm damage. So we appreciate them going up there and chipping in on that. And I'm sure the rest of them that were left behind are here to pick up the slack. So we appreciate the efforts for those folks as well.
Good, thank you.
All right, and the floor is yours.
Okay, very good, thank you. Thank you, Mayor, thank you, Council. Just want to take every opportunity we have right now to communicate out some very important information. Annually, we have a number of water quality parameters that we test for. We just recently got the results back from our lead and copper sampling and found that we actually exceeded in lead. So we're at an action level now. We haven't officially gotten that notification yet from DNR, but we want to start being very proactive in communicating that information. Ultimately, what does that mean? Where does that lead come from? So just from a standpoint, our raw water as we pump out of the ground does not contain lead. As it migrates or travels through our system, it doesn't contain lead. It actually gets lead once it actually gets into our service laterals, which if they contain lead. So service ladders can be made of a variety of different materials. One pretty much pre-1960 would be the typical cutoff in which you may have a lead service. So our water mains do not contain lead. It's really that lead service. The complicated piece to this is that the utilities, City of Stoughton actually owns that lead or the service from the main to the curb stop. But from the curb stop into the home, that's privately held. Another source of lead can be the lead fixtures that are in a home, lead solder. So lead can actually, once it comes into contact with water, it can actually become soluble and then has significant potential health impacts. So back to the testing as far as what we're doing there. What we've found is that basically we're required by DNR to do 30 samples, and those samples are actually taken at the tap. So we're responsible for the water quality all the way to the tap, even though we really only have control to the curb stop. Of those 30 samples, we found that 6 exceeded the action limits, which is 15 parts per billion. And so because of that, we're looking to be, take this as a huge opportunity. We want to be proactive as far as communicating to the public. We've actually already reached out to council, to the utilities committee. Today we also talked with the hospital, the clinics, daycare providers, really because lead is most susceptible for pregnant women and as well as young children. So we wanted to notify them as well, and so we also reached out to the schools. Going forward, though, we'll be continue to doing educational outreach to discuss this issue more, conduct additional testing, additional sampling as we go through that. And that's an opportunity to get us back into, a compliant state. Over the next year, we'll be doing 60 samples. If, say, 10% or less are below that exceedance level, then we get back into that compliant state. Additional things that we'll be doing is continue to remove our lead services that we have on our side. Actually, this year 75 will be removed. Approximately, though, on the private side has been about 5. So again, we have greater opportunities there to further educate and encourage the private side of the customer, basically controlled side of that lead service to be replaced. Also, this is a really good opportunity for us to create a program together to work through what that program might look like, but to help support basically those lead service replacements, to have a plan long term so that maybe in 15 years we don't have lead within our system anymore. And I think that's really the goal here. There's, a variety of options that are out there related to this issue, but in the end of the day, what we need to do is get the lead out of the system altogether. The other thing that we're providing is that if you have a lead service and that you have a risk health factor, we're providing water pitchers to filter that water. And then we'll continue to work with DNR on this issue. We actually were in the same situation back in 2014. We exceeded at that point in time. We were able to actually get back in compliance with that 60 samples that I spoke of. Those those levels of lead actually in 2014 were higher than what we're seeing here at 2019. And the other thing I would like to highlight is that we've got 4,709 services within the community. We estimate about 750 of those are actually made of lead. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this, but we really just want to kind of keep you guys in the loop so you know what's going on. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to Jill. She'll be more than happy to answer them for you. Minutes and reports are in the packet. That would take us to public comment. We have a few people signed up to speak at public comment period. We ask if you could keep your comments to around 3 minutes or less. And the first person that is signed up tonight, I have Dale Besky. Come on up.
Actually, I don't really have a prepared statement. I was just available for questions.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll keep that in mind. Then I have Marcia Berrigan, and Michael is also here. Do you want to come up together, or how would you like to do this tonight?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for letting us speak. So my name is Mike Berrigan. I live at 1509 West Milwaukee Street. My wife is Marcia. We're the ones that have been sending you emails. Sorry for the spam. I think most of you understand our situation. Stoughton Utilities has a 12-foot easement, I think, all the way around our house. We'd like to build a fence to contain our 4 boys. We have 1 3-year-old, 2 1-year-old twins. It's very difficult. My wife is a stay-at-home mom to go out with all of the boys and contain them. They're too little to actually listen to direction at this point, so it's very difficult. So we want to talk about the agenda item. I think I indicated on the public forum. But on July 18th, the Combined Utilities and Public Works Committee passed proposed language to update the zoning ordinance. And while we appreciate the effort, we think that the proposed language has the following issues. It still prohibits outright putting a fence within a 12-foot easement. There's no provisions for flexibility. 12 feet is a sizable chunk of my yard and many other yards, as indicated by the petition which we provided, which has over 200 signatures from citizens of Stoughton. And I think I'd like to note, we included a handout, I don't know if everybody got it, but it contains all of the different communities within Wisconsin that have a municipal ordinance that the city owns, and the language that they have within their zoning code, or if they don't have language within their zoning code, about fences within easements. And after our review, and don't take our word for it, please do your own research, but we found that Stoughton's zoning ordinance, even with the amendment that was proposed from the councils, is still the strictest in the state of Wisconsin. Another issue that we found with the proposal, and no offense to Matt, but it does contain a lot of legalese when compared to other Wisconsin communities. It's dense, it's packed with a lot of language. I have a law degree from UW. I no longer practice, but I found it hard to understand even after a few readings. I think one of the goals of legislative writing should be that it's understandable to an average citizen within the city of Stoughton. This is not. It also doesn't address or account for Wisconsin State Statute 90.03, which my wife sent out, which requires partition fences between farming, agricultural land, and residential provisions. I think several lots, definitely ours, a lot of those on Milwaukee Street, border farming land and do not appear to be in compliance with the state statute. I think Matt had some follow-ups from the last meeting, but the Wisconsin Supreme Court did rule on this state statute in White versus City of Waterton. It was a unanimous decision that confirmed our reading of the state statute. Again, don't take our word for it. Please do your own independent research. But as of this time, the zoning code does not account for that state statute. So I think that we're actually in violation of state law by not having a fence between the farming lands and our residential subdivision. So asked for the committee in this meeting. So either in this meeting or the planning committee, please review the zoning ordinances that are already in place to deal with fences and utility easements from other Wisconsin communities. We think that they're clearer than the proposed language from last week's meeting. Why invent the wheel when we have other communities that already have adopted language that is working well for them? I don't understand it. A couple of examples of those, which we also provided to Holly. Marshfield, for instance, asks property owners to sign a waiver to excuse utilities for any damage done to the fence while accessing the easement. We think that's totally reasonable. Another option, Evansville prohibits fences and drainage easements unless the property owner obtains a written permission from a building inspector who determines that the fence will not restrict the flow of stormwater. Manitowoc also restricts fences and drainage easements, but allows property owners to construct the fence and easements as long as the property owners are aware that the utility company may remove the fence at the owner's expense. So what these examples have in common, which ours does not, is the flexibility to allow homeowners to assume the risk of damage to their fences if municipal utilities need to access the easement. What I found is we have two involved parties in this conversation. We have the convenience of the utility, but we also have the interest of property owners within this community. And as city council, I think we need to find a compromise between those two competing interests. The language that was proposed is too far over to one side, and I think we can do better. Let's see. So I think I've talked through a lot of this. I talked through Wisconsin statute 90.3. Closing statement, I mean, for me and probably for all of you, I would like to never talk about this topic again. I'm so sick of thinking about fences and easements, I can't tell you. I have 4 kids, I work a lot, and I'm tired. As I mentioned before, this ordinance, I think, has been added and removed a few times from the zoning code. And I think let's find a compromise that truly strikes a balance between the interests of the homeowners within this community and the community of the municipal utility. And I think then we can just have it set and be done with it. Thanks for this opportunity to talk.
Mine's a lot shorter, I promise. A compromise that only addresses the most extreme situations is not a compromise at all. I provided you all with 83 communities that have municipal utilities in Wisconsin. I did this because the utilities director told me that communities without a municipal utility tend to be even more lenient. So I focused only on those with a municipal utility. Not one other has an ordinance restricting fencing and easements. A few have excellent language that we could adopt. Many use the exact same language. I printed handouts and examples from Evansville, Marshfield, and Manitowoc. We need to live with this fence for 365 days a year. Why restrict so much of our yard when they might, probably, maybe, won't ever need to access it? I have a petition signed by 223 people supporting the removal of this ordinance. We ask that you vote in their favor. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have 2 other people signed up. Did you wish to speak? Oh, okay, all right. And so I had Greg Gilbert and Karen Griffin had signed up to support the removal of the ordinance. So that's in the record. And is there anyone else here that would wish to address the city council before we go to the next item? Hearing none. We'll move on with the consent agenda. There's 3 items in the consent agenda. I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Motion by Jensen. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Schumacher. Would anybody like anything removed from the consent agenda? Hearing none. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed? That carries. Takes us to old business, ordinance 21 of 2019. And that was at the last meeting that was at was the joint meeting between the Utilities and Public Works, and I believe Alderperson Bartlett would introduce this one.
Bring forth ordinance 21 of 2019 for second reading. This is amending zoning code section 78-718, paragraph 3, para I of the Stoughton Municipal Code. And I would move to approve.
Second.
And there's a motion and a second. Anything you'd like to add, Alderperson Bartlett?
This is one the joint meeting between the Utilities and Public Works held, as we said, on the 18th. The presentation from Utilities Director and discussion of it, it was recommended for approval, a vote of 10-1. And the language is in your packet.
Alderperson Jensen?
Just to point out that what's in the packet is the language from the first reading, which is to remove the ordinance.
Yeah, the new stuff isn't in there.
They're in there separately.
There's a 5A and there's a 5B.
That's true.
5B is the latest.
Yeah. So that's good. But I believe that to do that, it would have to be done as an amendment because it's a second reading from the original first reading. Am I correct?
I'm not sure what the issue is. Are we
Okay.
talking about removing something
The
from the
first
consent
reading
agenda?
was to remove the agenda, or to remove the ordinance. That was the first reading that came out of planning.
Oh, the first reading of the ordinance that was before the council at that time was to strike the language,
that.
correct?
Okay.
Then it went to committee.
Right, it went to committee, but now it's coming back for a second reading. If it is a second reading, it has to be from what was presented as the first reading.
Yeah, we had some discussion about that at staff, and the conclusion we reached, and I'm not certain this is the right answer, but my understanding was, and is that when an ordinance of this type is referred to the Common Council, the council is not bound to adopt only the language that has been referred by committee and that's before you. The council has the opportunity to either adopt it or adopt it with changes. Your question is it necessary for the council to have on the agenda or to first move adoption of what was recommended by the Plan Commission and then consider an amendment to that? You know, I'm not sure, Greg, that would be a workable procedure. I'm not sure that's the only available procedure. So I guess what you're doing is you're raising a point of order.
Yep.
And so I suggest you state your point of order, and then one solution to it, though, that you're offering is that the council could move approval of the ordinance as recommended by the Plan Commission.
And then it would have to
And then
be-
there could be a proposal to amend that and get this new language in front of you. And that would get you all there without having to resolve this underlying procedural issue.
Exactly.
And so I think the issue is that in the first instance, you've raised a parliamentary point of order, and the chair has to rule on that.
So really, the way it worked out is we had a recommendation from the Plan Commission, and then it came to a first reading. The council directed it to go back and have a joint meeting with Public Works and the utilities. So that's what we did, with the understanding that we'd be bringing back something. Could have been the same thing, could have been something different, could have been nothing at all. And the group came back with a recommendation that is in your packet. I'm more than happy to act on it any way you'd like. You know, if we want to say the motion on the table is the original one from the Plan Commission, we can certainly do that, and then we can open that up for an amendment if that's what you guys would do. I don't think it's worth really getting into a huge debate about.
I think the easiest way to get through this is for the chair to just make a ruling, and then if there's an objection to your ruling and there's a desire to vote on that at council, you can vote on it. So you can get there either way. So Mayor Swadley, if you rule in favor of the point of order, then you got the original language and there can be a decision.
That's fine. I can rule in favor of the point of order.
Thank you.
So really, the motion on the table is the recommendation that came out of the Plan Commission meeting. So we can open it up for discussion on that. And at any point, if somebody wants to make an amendment to that, you could certainly do that, or we could end the discussion and vote on that motion. Alderperson Jensen?
Yes, thank you. First, I wanted to thank Mayor Swadley, Attorney Dragney, all of the department heads, staff for all the work that they did in the rewrite of this ordinance, and just the work in general that they did on it. I appreciate what was done, and I know it was done in short notice, and a great deal of work went into authoring the compromise, even though I do not agree with it. I also want to thank the Bergens for all of the work that they did. Did a marvelous job of researching and bringing all of this information to us. Now I'd like to speak to the issue at hand, and what I see is this comes down to two things, and it's convenience and safety. And it's convenience for our employees, and it's convenience and safety for the Bergens. What I believe to be fair for the Bergens is to and still preserve the commitment to the city employees. That's where I stand. Is how do I do that? How do I preserve that commitment and still help them? And so the question is, for me, is how do we resolve this seemingly unsolvable issue? If we pass the amended ordinance, well, it's actually not an amended ordinance now. If we pass the ordinance, this would benefit the Berrigans to the point that they would be able to use this fence, be able to use their yard in a safe manner. The inconvenience, of course, would be to the utilities. The question is how often would they be inconvenienced? And for me, the family being able to use their yard 360 days a year for as many years as they live there versus maybe once a year or whenever or maybe never, that the utilities would need to have access to that area. I think it far outweighs, it's just in their favor. And so I would encourage you to vote for the ordinance change, which would be to eliminate the ordinance without any additions. So thanks for listening.
Alderperson Riley?
Thank you. I believe that that's not correct, Alderman Jensen. I believe that it maybe relieves one part of their issue, and that's the 30-foot, to some extent for the 12 feet. But if I'm not mistaken, it does not address at all, I think, their primary concern, which is, if I'm correct, it's their backyard area. Is it all right if I just get clarification somehow?
You should speak to the chair, and if
All
you
right,
need
I apologize.
clarification, staff can help.
Okay. Yeah, I would
facilitate
like
that.
clarification, because it's my understanding that it might, to some extent, address part of their issue, but I don't believe it addresses their primary issue. So if somebody can address that for me, please, I'd appreciate it.
I guess I'm not sure I can speak to their issue, but as far as what's located on that particular property is there's a 12-foot easement in the back of that property, which actually is how they're serviced by underground electrical. And then on the west side of the property, there's a 30-foot easement that actually has ATC and Stoughton Utilities as overhead electrical underbuilt.
And so if I may, on the side of the property, they will now have about an additional 12 feet or so that they can use?
They would have
18 feet?
18 feet, yeah,
Thank
correct,
you.
with the proposal.
And in the back, they have no leeway, am I correct?
That's correct.
All right, so it does not address what I understand to be their primary concern, which is that they have a farm field adjacent, right? And they have no barrier there, and when they are in the backyard with their children, they have concerns that something's going to happen where a child's going to wander into that field because they have no fence, and there's going to be something going on there, and it's going to cause harm to the child. That's the summary of their concern, as I understand it. I'm going to say that I also have a law degree from UW, as does Mr. Berrigan, as does Mr. Dregny, I believe. I find this confusing, too. I read this a few times, and I think I finally get the rub, but it takes a bit. And that's not to disparage the work that went into it, because I know there was a lot of work and a lot of consideration, but I think the language is confusing. I also don't know how often this issue comes up. It seems as though the way this has been approached is to look for all the potential problems, all the reasons to say no, and not enough of the reasons to say yes to the request by the Berrigans. I have a real concern with this. I share their concerns in their particular situation. It seems to me that they have made a suggestion here that, you know, if we can, we'll come to the city, we'll give you our plans, we'll ask you for permission to build in this easement. The city still has that decision-making authority. The concerns I see state are, well, that takes time, that takes this, that takes that. But again, I just don't know that this happens that often. And this is a very serious concern that our citizens have here. I've had a number of emails on this from people. Ms. Berrigan advised that she had, I think, over 200 families sign saying they'd like to see something different than what we're looking at doing here tonight. And I agree with that. I don't see this as a real problem. I don't see, frankly, using their language unless a written exception has been made by the affected utility to be determined on a case-by-case basis. I don't see where that should be a problem, honestly, or an insurmountable problem at all. And this is a real concern that these parties have, and it's a legitimate concern. There's also the issue that Mr. Berrigan raised with respect to the, state statute. And I did talk with Director Shield briefly before this meeting, and I'm not sure how that's impacted or how that's affected, but it seems that something is awry here, because it does seem pretty clear that there should have been some partition erected there by the developer or something, and that never happened. I don't know how we remedy that. I don't know how we resolve those two things, but I oppose this as written, and I believe it's not at all unreasonable or untoward for there to be an exception, case-by-case basis. They discussed, Mr. Berrigan discussed, the fact that, and I think it's perfectly legitimate, the fact that they can provide indemnification, they can provide a waiver from damages in the event that the city were to have to breach that fence or destroy the fence or whatever. They're willing to do that. I think that would be part of a reasonable and appropriate compromise here as well. I basically support what they are asking us to do, and I think that we should vote no on this ordinance as written.
Attorney Dragon.
If I could just clarify, so the ordinance, the motion that's before the council is to adopt the ordinance that was recommended by the Plan Commission, which would repeal entirely the requirement or the prohibition on placing fences in utility easements. So I just want to make it clear that the current motion that's pending is not to approve the ordinance that came out of the Utilities Committee and the Public Works Committee, but rather the ordinance that was recommended by the Plan Commission, which was to entirely, delete from the current from the current code the language that prohibits placing a fence in a utility easement. So that's point number one. Point number two, so the language that was discussed initially at the Plan Commission was to modify the current code to say that fences are prohibited in utility easements unless the affected utility approves placing the fence there. Some language to that effect. I did have a concern, just a legal concern, about structuring a zoning code in a way that states a rule, but then allows relief from the rule based on some third party agreeing. This would be like, I've had the situation where a community asked me, can we adopt an ordinance that says you can't do this unless you get your neighbors to approve it? I think that's an unlawful delegation of authority to a third party to make a decision about that. The proper procedure for getting relief from a zoning restriction would be a variance, for example. And so my recommendation to the Plan Commission was, look, I would be more comfortable from a legal standpoint just striking the prohibition entirely than by leaving it in, but giving the owner the opportunity to go to utilities and ask their permission. I have, from a legal standpoint, what if they go and they ask permission and the utility says no? What's their recourse then? There are no standards to govern that decision. And so that's an unusual way to approach it. So I just wanted to chime in those points.
So just for clarification, if we adopt the ordinance that is on the table, if this passes, will they actually have to get permission from utilities, or are they free to put up a fence anywhere, anytime, in any easement in the city of Stoughton?
Okay, so if the language in the zoning code prohibiting fences in utility easements is deleted, that means that there's no zoning impediment to putting a fence in the easement. There still is a question about whether the easement itself is such that they're not allowed to put the fence on that property without violating the terms of the easement. In some cases, the answer to that is clear. So for example, the 30-foot easement affecting their property, there is a recorded easement that actually says no fences. And that one apparently was, that's an easement held by ATC. And ATC, they've talked to ATC, and ATC has said, we'll work with you to allow you to put a fence in that 30-foot easement. So they've got some process for doing that. But with respect to the 12-foot easement that was dedicated for use by utilities on a plat, the only language we have that describes the various rights and obligations under that easement are two words on a plat, utility easement. And the research we've done indicates that whether or not a fence is allowable or not under that easement is a fact-specific determination we can't make. I can't tell you how a court would rule on that. Frankly, I think the issue would be, could the utility show that putting a fence within that easement would unreasonably interfere with its ability to use the easement for its purposes? And if the court found that yes, it would, then then the court would presumably rule that you can't put the fence there. And I think that if I was advising a utility, if this ordinance wasn't here and the utility was faced with trying to decide, well, should we allow fences or not, if the owner comes to us, I would say, well, that's the test I would apply. I would say, is the fence going to unreasonably interfere with your operations? And if you think it would, then I would say no, and if you think it wouldn't, then I would say yes. So that's kind of the legal lay of the land as I see it.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, well then, from the standpoint of the procedural matter, I have no problem striking the ordinance altogether. If that's where we are, it seems to me, though, that what we're going to do then is come back to what we have here tonight with respect to the suggestions and the proposals from the committee. So it's really pointless. But I certainly would support just striking the language altogether at this point, if that's what we're going to vote on. If that's the motion before...
That's what's before the council.
Very good. I have no problem supporting that. I suspect then we'll be going somewhere else from there, but...
Okay. I have Alderperson Borisma and then Hirsch.
I have a kind of fly in the ointment question, especially for Matt. As I understand it, this property is adjoining a farmland.
Two
farmer,
farmlands, one on the side and one on the back.
if the farmer would put up a fence by state law on the side and the back, as they're apparently required to do, would that fly in the face of ordinance?
So here's what I can tell you about the statute so far. And I can tell you that there are questions I have about the statute that I don't think are going to be easy to answer, and there's no case law yet. First, the case that we do have that was referred to, that was decided last year, the issue in that case was there was an existing fence. There was no dispute about where the fence should be located. The dispute was between neighboring property owners over who was responsible to pay for maintaining it. And one of the the farming property owner invoked the enforcement procedures in the statute and said, city, you have a duty to determine who is required to pay to maintain this fence. You have that obligation under the statute. The city said, oh, we don't have that obligation. That only applies to towns. And the court said, no, actually it applies to cities and towns and villages. And so, city, you have an obligation to determine and allocate responsibility for the cost of maintaining the fence. Now, what's unanswered is how the court would interpret the statute where a property owner says there should be a fence between the farmland and the non-farmland, but there's an easement that says no fence. What does that mean? Does that mean that the statute invalidates that the court would say, well, we're hereby declaring every utility easement in the state of Wisconsin located on a property line that prohibits fences, we're hereby invalidating that? Possible. We don't have a case that says that today. Or would a court say, we're going to say that this statute preempts local authority to prohibit fences in utility easements, prohibits you from using your zoning authority to do that? We don't have a case that says that. It seems to me that a more likely outcome, although I might be wrong, a more likely outcome would be that a court would say there's a requirement that a fence be located, but it needs to be located in a way that accommodates or is responsive to restrictions that apply, such as easements or other or city ordinances or what have you. Now, can I guarantee that's the outcome? No. I mean, I don't think we'll know the answer to that question unless somebody actually litigates this. But it seems to me that's kind of the choice the court would face. The court would have to say, are we going to say that this statute that was adopted in, I believe, 1845 by the territorial legislature before Wisconsin became a state, actually was intended to invalidate utility ordinances, or at least elements of those ordinances that prohibit fences, and preempt local zoning authority in this arena? So that would be one choice. Or they would say, no, owners, you can compel you can require a fence there, but the precise location of the fence is subject to a determination that needs to be made that would be taking those restrictions into account. And so if I was advising the city, if the city was appointing a fence viewer, First time I ever heard of a fence viewer was when I learned about the statute. But in a case where some of the land is in the town, some of the land is in the city, we could have a procedure under which both the town and the city would be required to appoint a fence viewer, and those two fence viewers would have a legal obligation to determine potentially where the fence should go and how it should be paid for. And then there would be enforcement procedures in place. So it could be that that would be the result, but again, I'm speculating somewhat because we don't have definitive answers.
And just to add one other thing, it's also possible that at one point there was an agreement between the landowners to put markers there. We don't know if that occurred or not, but that's also included in the statute, so that could have been done. We don't know the answer to that question. Alderperson, oh, go
I just
ahead.
on that point, because I've heard that issue come up a number of times, and I note that there's a description about procedurally how a petition needs to be made and verified. And if there was an agreement by adjoining owners at some point to use markers, I think that would have had to have been in writing, signed and sealed, and witnessed by two witnesses. So if we can't find the writing, it's probably not something that we could rely on.
I had Alderperson Hirsch and then Boersma. Anybody over here after that? Go ahead.
Okay. First, I want to thank everybody that's worked on this amendment. I think, unlike the lawyers in the room, I was able to understand it, and I didn't think it was too complicated. So, I guess the question is, yes, I want, community to be safe, but I also want our utilities, people to be safe, and if anything, God forbid, happens again to our city, that we need to have a lot of utility workers getting into places. I don't want them to be delayed because of all the different fences and all the different obstacles to them. It's not their job to remove fences. It's not their job to, work in unsafe conditions. It's our job to make sure that they have safe conditions and rights of way that they can get to poles without having to climb them and use the equipment that's made for them. I feel for this family. We're not saying that they cannot put a fence up. We just, it's unfortunate their lot is situated where their house is smack dab in the middle of a small lot, which doesn't allow them to have a large area of a fenced-in area with the fence. But we're not saying that they can't have a fence. It just has to be in a smaller area to accommodate, the easements. And they did, which was great, get some permissions from ATC to go in 18 more feet. So those are all great things. So with that said, I really do commend what we did together to put together kind of some guidelines of how to say yes fence, no fence. I thought that was very thorough. And so therefore, I'm going to make I'd like to make an amendment to the motion on the table to amend it to incorporate what the Joint Utilities and Public Works have recommended to that ordinance. So we're actually looking at what this joint committee and the leadership of the city actually developed. And that's what I'd like to make the amendment.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
A second by Alderperson Bartlett. So now we're discussing the amendment. Did everybody understand the amendment? And that would be basically the other document that's in the packet. Alderperson.
And just to make, I just want to make sure everyone understands, so the issue on the table now is whether to amend the main motion. If that's approved, then that will still be before you, and you'll have to debate that, and that could be further amended. If that's not approved, then the main motion remains as stated.
So my question would be then, if we're amending the main motion and everything is struck on the main motion, what does that mean?
Well, essentially, what that would mean is that the language that's been before you pursuant to the main motion would be replaced by the language would be before you if the amendment is adopted. And that language would be what came out of the joint committee meeting.
Okay, everybody understand that? Okay, Alderperson, the head Riley, and then Hiley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Again, I'm going to say this because I think it's just true. I think we're looking for so many reasons not to do this that we're forgetting the reasons why we should. And that's what's concerning to me here. I'm looking at the handout that the Berrigans provided to us, and there are a goodly number of utilities that allow this type of thing. And there's apparently no terrible concerns with respect to safety or ability to do work or anything else here. I also don't know how many of these instances we have. Are we creating this type of a rule and it's going to apply to the Berrigans and to nobody else? It just seems that this is a solution in search of a problem. And honestly, I oppose it. I don't care for it. I think that we need to accommodate this request. I cannot imagine that this is going to create some horrible situation where we are going to have utility workers imperiled, where we are not going to be able to provide services to the city. I don't believe it. I don't. And again, so I oppose this. I think that we should be sensitive to this situation, and I think there are other situations, probably not very many, that where citizens probably could use a fence and would be prohibited from doing it without any great benefit to the utilities of the city at all. So again, I continue to oppose this, and I really wish that I hope that people will think about this from the standpoint of what we are doing here, how it's impacting individual citizens without, I would suspect, a great deal of benefit to the city or the utilities.
Alderperson Hiley?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about an aspect of the issue that I don't think has come up in the previous talks, that as Executive Parisi mentioned earlier, by coincidence, as our climate crisis worsens, we're having more and more intense storms, which means more outages, and hotter summers. So I think these outages will be getting more dangerous to our oldest and youngest residents, and that's something we need to consider as well. So I do think it is important for our utilities to be able to access where they need to in an emergency situation. But I'm also concerned by this state statute as well. I really don't think we have clarity on that, and the way we get clarity might be, through actually litigating it. Who knows?
Okay, I had Alderperson Reeves, and then Director Weiss wants to speak as well.
Well, I had a question, so you might be ready to address this, but sorry. So I'm very sympathetic to homeowners and the wish for a larger fence, but I also would like to remind us that this is an ordinance that needs to be fit for the city and everyone in the community. And there has been a lot of conversation about the inconvenience for utility workers, but I think it's more than that. I think Alderperson Hiley touched on it, then it could be a timeliness when we have major disasters. And some of us, it might be a matter of inconvenience, but if there's people on oxygen or have other medical equipment, and it's postponed because of, multiple offenses perhaps, or encumbrances, I guess I'd like to know from your perspective. We had the benefit of a presentation that showed some of the challenges in reaching some of the utilities. And I don't know if you all happen to see that in your packet, but maybe you could address some of the realities of time as opposed to inconvenience.
Absolutely. So anytime we have to go into an area, there really is the time as far as how quickly we can restore. So as much as that may be an inconvenience to not have a fence, or there may be damage to that fence that occurs, we've actually physically got to get to that location. On May 25th, when we had the storm event that came through, we had a number of situations where having this ordinance in place actually really helped us, not having that encumbrance, and so we were able to get to restore much more quickly than we could otherwise. I think the comment as far as stormwater and the flooding, I mean, we're opening up that fences could go into those areas and potentially back up water and and create additional flooding. The other thing that I think we need to think about very strongly is the fact that we've got water mains in some of these easements. So if we have a water main break, how do we quickly get in there and address that water main? Or if we have sanitary sewer in those locations and there's a backup and now we're potentially bringing sewage back into a basement and we have a blockage and we need to get to that area very quickly. So absolutely, there's a time to restore, and actually having the ability to get in there quickly can be life or death. I mean, there is situations. Actually, this last week we had a situation where we had to shut down power because there was a gas dig-in. The main concern of the calls that we got were related to the heat. You know, there was a indice of high enough, and there was concern that I just lost my power, and now I'm in the, you know, basically without air conditioning. And so this does go beyond those individual property owners and our ability to respond quickly and help support the entire community.
How do other towns handle it?
We can't let you speak from the crowd. Sorry, it's one of our rules. I get it. It's a very emotional issue for all of us. Did anybody else have any questions or comments about the amendment? Alderperson Hiley.
I'm wondering about possibly, and this would be a further complication of the amendment, but possibly adding language about property being in compliance with this state statute, about perhaps putting a fence at the property line or near the property line. Just, I think that might be a solution, and I would invite discussion about it.
Alderperson Boersma.
Yeah, we haven't discussed a lot about this, but there are fences and there are fences. And some are fairly portable fences and some are stationary that are difficult to take up out of the ground and that kind of thing. Seems to me that if another idea would be that the utilities would approve not necessarily the location of the fence, but the type of fence that might behoove them to be able to move it or whatever fairly quickly. You know, it's just an idea. I think we've tried to come up with a compromise that applies to especially this family. But we also have other people who are going to be affected by this. I think a fence, you know, I'm a farm kid, you know, and we had some fences to contain heifers and bulls, and some of the fences were just sort of decorative, you know, when I grew up. So it seems to me that the utilities could potentially approve what kind of fence would go in there to make it just as easily accessible as possible.
Okay, thank you. I mean, at this point, we haven't really talked about that, and really the research we did was on the ordinance itself. I would say a couple things. First of all, there's been many examples that have come to us since this discussion began where people thought that the city was limiting their ability to put in a fence. And in many cases, it turned out not to be because of the ordinance or the easement. It could have been a DOT right-of-way. It could have been a covenant. It could have been, in most cases, it was not the easement that is causing the problem for homeowners that want to put up a fence. So it's really important for homeowners, if they don't understand what the situation is, to reach out to us, because we can fairly quickly provide some information that might help them better understand what the restrictions are and what the source of that restriction is. And in many cases, it's not because of this ordinance. And I think that's one thing that's out there, is that a lot of people think that this is like a silver bullet. If we get rid of this ordinance, it's going to make all of our fence issues go away. And I would argue it's just going to create more fence issues. It's going to create some unintended consequences because of utilities, and pretty soon it'll be, you know, more than just fences. It'll be swing sets and sheds and trees and everything else, and we already have some of that right now. and it's a difficult thing for us to enforce, even the way it is. Those are the things that I think we need to think about here, and what we try to do is come up with a compromise, and based on the input that we get from all the stakeholders, and put together something that, in a situation that can help improve as many as we can without the detriment to the rest of the community, because there are other people in the community that reached out to us and said, hey, we like the fact that we can get our power restored quickly. We like the fact that we know our employees can go in there and get out of there and do it safely. We like the low utility rates we have in Stoughton because you can work more efficiently. So what we're trying to do is balance all that when we bring the proposals to you guys and ultimately the policymakers. So it's been kind of an interesting couple weeks, but the amount of feedback that we've received has been tremendous. I mean, it's much appreciated by myself. I know I learned quite a bit during this process, and hopefully, at the end of it, we can at least continue to try to come up with solutions to this and any other situations that we run in, and do it in a way where everybody can, still get along at the end of the day. So I think that's been pretty encouraging for me to see how people have rallied together on this issue. Does anybody else have any questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Question for council. If this body passes the language as proposed by the committee, would a citizen still have the right to seek a variance from this at all, or is it a foregone conclusion?
Matt can answer that question for you.
So the citizen would still have a right to seek a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals, but I want to make sure everyone understands that the legal standard for obtaining a variance is a difficult standard to meet. It's I wouldn't view that as something that would solve the problem, for example, for the folks you've heard it from tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if we had a variance process, my understanding is it would go to the Board of Appeals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Alderperson Legacki.
I have a question on the very first amendment, striking all of the language and not considering this new language. If it were to be struck down tonight, the first motion, and in a time of allowing for residents to negotiate with utilities and other companies, is it possible to bring things back after study, like all of these other municipalities that don't have such ordinances, and we study how it's working for them? Will we be able to add language that appears to be even more researched, even more compromise, not just based in the ordinance, but rather the real experiences of all these municipalities? Would we be able to add in things?
Yeah, we certainly could, and I would tell you that based on some research and follow-up I did on some of these, even without some of these that don't have the ordinance, they don't necessarily allow the fences and the easements. Some of them have different setback requirements and those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, on many of them, you still have to get permission or authorization to do it. So by getting rid of the ordinance doesn't mean that, in these cases that don't have an ordinance, that doesn't mean you can put a fence in.
Right.
It's just the way to get there, I guess. Did you have something to follow up on that?
I did, because when I reached out, like Sun Prairie, they don't have an ordinance, but yet instead of on their language on their plats, that basically is a dark line that represents the property line, then a dashed line that says utility easement across it, they also do a recorded document like ATC to protect that easement, to say that there's no fence in there. So as much as the research went through and maybe searched for the word fence and then documented what may be there, there's other pieces to that that I don't know if are completely fleshed out in that research. So I guess I would just caution as far as being able to recognize if they don't have an ordinance, it doesn't mean that they don't have a mechanism already in place to prohibit fences.
I want to make a point here, just so you know, that no matter what decision the council makes tonight on the zoning ordinance, we've talked at a staff level about the need to make a decision about how to improve our procedure when we're reviewing plats to make sure that we do have more clarity as to what restrictions would apply in those utility easements. And that's going to be a council decision. And so let's say, for example, you decide, whatever you decide tonight, we're still going to have a discussion about when we've got a plat that we're approving and we're going to require dedication of utility easements, how are we going to approach that? What restrictions are we going to build into that process? And we haven't actually started working on that yet, but that will be coming before you take action on the next plat that comes before you. I'd expect we'd hope to have something ready for you to consider.
I'm not sure who was first over
I
here.
was first.
Okay, Alderperson Borisman.
I have a question of Jill, and that is, why did we come up with 12 feet instead of 6 or 8 or 10 or 3 or whatever?
12 feet is because that's basically our accessibility. And in particular case of the lot that we're speaking of, there's 12 feet on the one side because there's not the ability to get that easement on the other side. So in plats where we actually have, say, lots back up to each other, we would take 6 on each side of that lot. But that's basically our ability to get in there, get access, to be able to not have any encumbrances in the way.
I see, and then, but then the 6 feet would apply, for instance, to the Berrigans. I mean, you know, if they had 6 feet and the farmer on the other side would not have a fence there, then it seems to me that there would be enough room to get a truck in on both the farmer's field and also the Berrigans' field with giving them 6 feet.
We have no real right, though, to go onto that. We don't have an easement, you know, it would be restoration, like whereas ATC, they've actually got 30 feet on the one property that we've been talking about, as well as in the farm field. They've got a total of 60-foot easement there to be able to service their lines to protect that area.
I'm just saying that in this particular event, you know, we have it's a special situation where you have a fence within an easement, but you also have a fair amount of easement on the other side of it that you could use for accessing a vehicle, because you'd have 6 feet and you'd have another whole slew of room on the other side because it's a farm field. You know, I mean, it seems to me that it's a little bit arbitrary, actually, on the 12
We don't have
feet.
permission, though, and so, you know, whatever damage, you know, we don't have the right to really access that.
Why? Because you have an easement.
We don't have an easement.
Oh, you don't have an easement on
We
the
don't have an
farm.
easement, no. ATC has an easement. They have basically 30 feet on each side of that property that can take back basically that whole entire transmission line, but we don't have anything on because that actually is the town of Dunkirk.
I know, but the easement is there for ATC affecting the use of the property for Stoughton Utilities. So it seems to me that you know, a big truck could, I mean, you wreck part of the Berrigan's land, you wreck part of the, you know, to get in there. And I'm just not sure why it's exactly 12 feet. It's because of the truck. But if a truck needs to get in, or a utility vehicle to get in to fix whatever the utility is, they can use, because of the easement on the other side, that they can use part of that land on the farmer's field. So if you need extra room, especially in this particular situation, you have an emergency vehicle that could go on the farmer's field because they don't have a legal fence there.
Well, we don't have a right to be on the farmer's field. We'd be trespassing. And, you know, you got to picture it. If the power goes out and Joe receives a phone call at 2 in the morning, you know, at 2 in the morning, we're going to go out, we're going to try to fix the power line or whatever the issue is. It's going to be dark out. We're probably not going to want to call the farmer at 2 in the morning and say, hey, can we get permission to come on your land?
But there's an easement.
The easement is...
It's dedicated to ATC.
The easement is on the city property. It's not on the farmland property. So we can't go into the farm field because we'd be trespassing.
Just to be clear, on one property line, there is a 60-foot wide easement,
Right.
half of 30 feet on the the
I
lot,
know,
30
I've
feet in
seen
the
that.
farm field. On another property line, there's a 12-foot easement entirely on the private lot. The reason that was done, I think, is because, again, the land adjacent to that lot, adjacent to that 12-foot easement, was not subdivided. It's not part of the plat. So the developer kind of was forced to provide the entire 12-foot width of the easement just on that lot. And so that's why they're subject to 12 feet there.
My point is that you look at the Berrigan's, you don't need permission because you have the easement to go on their property, but ATC already still has the easement onto the farmer's field. And you have to
The
get
different
permission
farmer.
from. Yes,
Different
you
farmers.
get permission from the farmer, but
It's
you don't
also
have to
a different
get
entity.
permission from Berrigan. I don't know.
It's also a different
I
entity.
mean, really, at the end of the day, and I said this at the joint meeting, is in the offer to purchase, it's right in there. There's a warning and capital letters, and the responsibility at some point is on the homeowner to do their due diligence, and as a realtor, you know that.
I don't know.
And unfortunately, in the particular case, I don't know what happened, but I know that there's other people in the community that said it is important that the city maintain the rights of these utilities to keep our power going and to keep our costs down and to do it in a safe way. And I think what we tried to do here is we were able to provide basically 18 feet of relief on the one side with the proposed amendment, which I think helps. Does it solve all the problems on the particular landowner? No. And there's just really no way to please everybody on this type of issue, and we really tried to do what we could, listening to the feedback from all the stakeholders to come up with this. And I don't really know if there's really much more we can say on it. Alderperson Riley, go ahead.
Thank you,
I'm sure you
Mayor.
have something to say about it.
Of course I do, thank you. I am going to breach one of the sacred rules of litigation for an attorney. I'm going to ask a question to which I do not know the answer, but this did go away from 2009 to sometime in 2011. Do we have any indication that there was great chaos or really extremely difficult circumstances or situations that arose for that period of time when we did not have this prohibition? Is there any evidence that caused catastrophes or difficulties or problems? Any record of that? Does anybody know?
Point of order, can you say a little bit more about the history
Sure,
of this?
you bet. In the information that we were provided, it gives us the history of this particular ordinance. And at one point, as I read it, from 2009 to 2011, it just went away. It wasn't there. So that was our time frame, I guess, where we'd have an example of what happens if it's not there. And there's no indication that there were any great catastrophes or that there was difficulties or that service was interrupted and the world came to an end. So I'm just curious if there is anything that would indicate that there were substantial issues during that time frame when this did not exist.
I'm not really sure because I don't know if anybody knew it wasn't there. We didn't know it wasn't there.
Well, that might say something in itself too, I would think, Mayor, right?
The understanding I have is the reason it wasn't there is because we rewrote all the ordinances and we used some boilerplate material that didn't have it in there. So then once we discovered, oh, this is missing, then it was put back in. That's my understanding.
Sure, and I understand that.
They wouldn't have put it in unless they felt there was a reason to put it in. Do you have?
And we recognized it at the utility because we started to see fences in our easements, and there's some pictures that I presented at the joint meeting where we've got, people cutting into our underground electrical and a variety of different things during that time. So we recognized, oh, how is this happening? Recognized that the easement wasn't there, and so at least that's my understanding, and so brought it forward to have it reinstated.
President Majewski.
To answer your question for proof, the 100 block of North Monroe Street, you have utility lines between the yards and the back. I defy you to see a utility crew get through there to do the work on the maintenance of that line.
I couldn't answer that because I don't know the fence. I've not seen the fence. I don't know what it's made of, and I don't know how tall it is or anything else.
It's
But
continuous fences
yeah,
on both sides,
yeah.
all the way down, underneath the power lines.
So are they being required to dismantle all of that, given this ordinance, or what are we doing there?
Look at it.
We can't,
You
they're
can't, they're
grandfathered
grandfathered
in.
in.
Okay.
And I think, was that one of the slides that were in the PowerPoint?
It was, yep, we had
Yeah,
a
it's in the packet,
picture
if you
of-
want to see a
of-
picture of it.
You asked the question.
Oh, well, I told you. I am violating a sacred rule, but I still don't think I got the complete answer anyway, so thank you.
Director Weiss, go ahead.
I think that's one of the compromises that we really looked at hard with this ordinance is how do we try to blend the need to basically restore quickly, to do that at a reasonable cost, to not create an additional liability to actually then restore these fences, because we got the legal opinion from City Attorney Dragney that ultimately we take down a fence, it's case by case. So we're in the situation of then probably putting all those fences back at the cost of the ratepayers, unaffected by those single, people who want their fences, but ultimately that comes back to rates that affect the entire community. There was in the presentation some pictures from the May 25th event where in the end we were able to restore very quickly because you could see the fences were outside of our easement. We actually had cross arms get taken down by tree branches, and so they were able to back in one of their bucket trucks and actually, fix that very quickly compared to if we had to deal with the fences or if we had to climb those poles. It's been brought up before, but we're set up really to use our bucket trucks. So we climb poles very infrequently, intentionally, because it's much more dangerous than if we can access those lines with a bucket. It's actually much faster as well, so we're able to get there quickly, restore things. So I just want to kind of, caution as we move forward with this. There's an inherent benefit that goes beyond just the utility, that goes beyond just an individual property owner, but it impacts all of the ratepayers as far as the fences and what things they can create for the entire community.
Attorney Dragney?
I just wanted to describe one of the issues that we worked through at a staff level as we were trying to find a solution to this problem. And one of the things we talked about is the fact that there's going to be, regardless of how the council resolves this issue, there's going to need to be some kind of administrative infrastructure in place to deal with requests to put up fences. So the infrastructure that's being used today administratively is through the Planning and Zoning Department. That they already have to intake permit applications for people who want to put up fences. So they're doing that now, and one of the things they have on their list of things to check is it a utility easement? And if it is, then under the current ordinance, they say, well, you can't put it here, or you'd have to move it outside the easement. Stoughton Utilities, at this point, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm going to say something that I might not, I'm going to break the rule. As far as I know, Stoughton Utilities has no procedure or process in place right now for administering the installation of fences in the city of Stoughton. I don't know if you have any program in place for that either, so, but I guess where I'm going with this is we recognize that there has to be a process. And so one process is through the zoning process, staff that you're using today. If we eliminate that, which we certainly could do, then I think Stoughton Utilities would have to say, okay, now it's just up to us to figure out how to deal with our easements and how to decide how and when to enforce our easement rights and how to respond to requests from property owners to put fences in their easements. And if that's what we do, if that's the direction the council takes, I think what will happen is that staff will come back to council with a proposed policy to be adopted by Stoughton Utilities for how to administer this. From a legal standpoint, that would make my life simpler in a sense, because we're just dealing with easements, and we're not dealing with a zoning ordinance too. And I only have to think about, easements, and I don't have to think about zoning ordinances. But I just want you guys to know that the issue doesn't go away. I mean, it's really, I think you're really making a choice about whether to use your zoning staff and procedures to process applications for fences and decide when they're allowed and when they're not allowed, or whether you want to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to use the easements, and we're gonna say to Stoughton Utilities, hey, Stoughton Utilities, you come to us with a proposed policy that we can consider for when to say yes and when to say no.
So
You're only
great, you won't even know I said
According
it.
to Robert's rules, you're only supposed to get 3 whacks at, but I'll give you an extra one.
I appreciate that.
What I'll say is this, one, with respect to the concerns as far as the cost to everyone, et cetera, et cetera. I do believe there's a solution to that from the standpoint of agreements with respect to waivers and indemnification, et cetera. So should the utility need to do something, they are protected from the standpoint of the homeowners, and that can run with the land, waivers, et cetera, indemnifications. That's one. And then lastly, really, all that is being asked here, it seems to me, is can we have some discretion? Can we have somebody come to the authority, whoever that may be here, and ask them to employ some discretion in particular instances? And I just, again, I don't think that's untoward. I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think it's unduly burdensome. So I continue to maintain my position. Thanks.
Thank you. Alderperson Legaki.
In the First Amendment, if we remove that language, knowing that that came through planning at that time, I've been really moved by the efforts of all sides to really try to work and find common ground. And it's been difficult, I think, with this language that's existing in the amendment tonight. I don't think we're quite there. And so I find myself wanting to listen to all these sides and say we're not there. And so a part of me is thinking I want to vote for removing the language, the First Amendment, appreciating the great work of all of the people that have done this. And boy, I also really respect first responders, and in among that, utility crews, knowing the realities of that and what can happen. And I think we can find a better way than what exists right now, and this challenging. And so I guess I'm not afraid of letting go of where it's at and re-go at it and not look at this through zoning anymore, but rather through the issue at hand, and that's easements.
Alderperson Bartlett.
Yeah, we went over this a lot with the public utilities and public works and joint committee meeting as well. And a lot of issues here, and this is a tough one. My first response was, I was wondering how other utilities got away without having any easement restrictions in other communities. And I started also looking at other WPPI members, which we are because we have our own municipal utility. And there are a lot of others, there's a handful of other communities that have the same restrictions and easements that we do. We are not alone in this. A lot of them have restrictions on it in different methods. And I think for different reasons, well, all for the same reasons, I think it's good for protection of the community as well. We're spending a lot of time trying to revise this for one residence, which I don't think they'll still be able to build there. So you're not really going to be able to put a fence on top of electrified distribution lines anyways. That's just not a safe practice, just physically. So I don't know that they would be able to build the fence there if we repealed this anyways the way it is. I think for the safety of workers, and we also talk about safety of the community. If you look up north right now, there's communities that have been out of power for 5 days going on. We don't want extended restoration times. We have a lot of elderly, we have a lot of communities here, we have the hospital, we have a lot of things where we don't want an extended outage. So for safety of our community, I support this restriction to protect the easement areas for utilities, and I'm going to vote to support it.
Alderperson Hirsch.
I greatly appreciate everything that Alder Bartlett just said. I mirror that, and therefore I want to call the question.
Okay. The call to question takes a 2/3 vote.
Yep.
Okay. Does it need a second? I don't think it does, but I don't
can't remember.
Doesn't? Okay. So there's a motion to
Motion to close debate.
And call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Nay.
Second is required.
Yep.
I second it.
Huh?
Second is required.
Oh, second was required. Tom seconded it.
Okay.
Okay. And then it was, what, 11 to 1?
Yes.
Okay. So the question on the table is on the amendment. So we'd be voting on that. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
No.
Roll. We can do a roll call.
Please.
As soon as Holly's ready, we'll do the roll call.
Boersma,
Aye.
Caravello,
No.
Doom,
Aye.
Hiley,
Aye.
Hirsch,
Aye.
Jensen,
Nope.
Bagaki,
No.
Mieski,
Aye.
Reeves,
Aye.
Riley,
No.
Schumacher,
Aye.
Bartlett.
Aye.
That motion carries on a vote of 8-4.
Okay, so then that would take us back to the original motion as amended. Is there any more discussion or debate on that? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nope.
No.
2 noes. That motion carries. Okay. Next item is new business, R-117 of 2019, and that's coming from Planning Commission. Alderperson Caravello, would you like to introduce this?
Sure. Resolution 117, 2019, approving an extraterritorial jurisdictional land division request by Dale Beskey for property located at 1421 Tower Drive, Town of Dunkirk, Dane County, Wisconsin. Plan Commission recommends, voted 7-0.
And that's motion?
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Who was it?
Either one.
It was a tie.
Arm wrestle for it, or what? Who was it?
Tie goes to the Irishman.
That would be you, right?
That's right.
Second by Riley. Okay, anything you want to add to that, Phil?
It seemed like it was a pretty simple where they want to separate a house and shed from the adjoining farm property, and just came to us because it's within our ETJ area.
Okay. Anything anyone else wants to add? Mr. Beskey's here. He's been waiting patiently. Either that or he just came to see how we operate, huh? Okay, I thought so. Anything you want to say? Okay, all right.
It's just a straightforward division. The land that's being divided is 1.2 acres. I think it was just over an acre. Includes the septic and the shed and the house, and there will be a driveway easement for the driveway, which is being retained for the farmland.
Easement.
And I guess that's kind of the sum of it.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Any questions or comments?
Mr. Beskey, have you ever been compelled to serve as a fence viewer?
As a fence viewer?
Yes.
We had one case in the town of Rutland where we almost had to do that, and then the property owners decided it. So I never got involved. And that was 28 years between Planning Commission Board and Town Chair.
No, so I need to go to the bathroom. No more questions.
Go ahead, Sid.
Are you aware there's a rule, and we know it through the realtors, is that when you build a fence, the person on the opposite side of the fence has a responsibility to maintain anything from the middle of the fence to the right, and the property owner who built the fence has the necessity to maintain the fence on the right side as you look toward the fence.
Yeah, there was something about you walk around it in this direction and figure it out, but we never, I was fortunate to never get to that.
And that's state law, actually.
Right.
So,
And it's been around, I think, 1850s or something, long time.
It was in the Magna Carta.
Okay, any, Alderperson Bartlett?
Mr. Beskey, just a curiosity, can you tell me what the science fund is that owns this? Is that agricultural science, or it says Aldemus
Oh,
Science
the
fund?
Ultimus Science. My aunt was Elaine Ultimus Pazine, and she owned this farm and also the Ultimus Corners B&B is where she grew up. And her will and trust documents specified that the farm would be donated to a charitable trust in the name of Ultimus Pazine, as my mother's name was Pazine, my uncle was Pazine, and it'll be used to provide scholarships. And we're getting it ready to sell so that we'll have money to distribute, and it'll be kind of an ongoing
Wonderful.
fund for
Cool.
scholarships.
Thank you.
So 120-acre farm.
That's all. That's great. Thanks.
So,
Nice. Okay, so we have a motion on the table. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed, that carries.
okay.
Can
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Make a special request, can we take a brief recess?
We can, sure.
May we? Is that okay with all?
How brief?
Like 8 minutes at the most.
Okay. All right, we have a recess for 8 minutes.
Just leave it. Thank you. Timing. All right, here, I'll put on my time. Thank you.
Thank you for putting this You know, when you put that all together, you get metal.
recess. And we're at item number 7, which is R-118 of 2019. That's coming from the Planning Commission, Alderperson Caravello.
Resolution R-118 of 2019, resolution by the Common Council of the City of Stoughton conditionally approving the final plat for Stoughton Hospital. Planning Commission recommends council approval by a vote of 7-0.
And
And,
so, motion.
oh, and I so move. Thanks.
Is there a second?
It's second.
Second by Alderperson Jensen. Anything you'd like to elaborate on?
My only notes here, I think, as was a question earlier, is why Stoughton Hospital wanted the designation of a condo, and they just informed us that it was for their financing, to clear up some things with their financing and to satisfy their lenders. That was the appropriate terminology.
Okay. Any questions or comments?
Comment, I had a fellow constituent come and ask me if I had gotten a mailing from, because I live right near Stoughton Hospital, a block away, and we had, but my wife had not brought it to my attention, and she seemed to talk about discussing changing the home health building. And I just couldn't get my hands on that mailing, and life's been a little busy. I did not choose to go forward, but I'm just wondering, is anyone aware, or did anyone else on council receive a mailing about attending a meeting about the plans for that building, or at least the idea of the condominium?
Property owners within 300 feet are directly mailed of the public meeting. So that would have been the notice of the meeting that was held at the Plan Commission. So that's the direct mailing you may have received.
Okay.
But it didn't give any information except to say that it will be, yeah, so I didn't get any additional information other than, what I learned about afterwards, that it was related to finance is all I heard. I didn't hear anything about any other building plan specifically myself, but.
This doesn't change the uses of the property. It creates different ownership opportunities, or the tenant spaces within the facility could be under separate ownership. There's different units that are identified, but it's not intended to change the uses of the property.
Does that answer your question, or do you want us to do some more follow-up?
I would like, if we can get more follow-up, or at least have Stoughton Hospital speak. This is 2 meetings now where there's just questions, and a part of me just may choose to abstain because I feel I didn't do my homework on this part. It's a little unknown to me, and I don't feel comfortable taking a position either way. So yes, if we can get information, that would be greatly helpful, even though it may only be this fiduciary matter.
That was my understanding, but we can certainly ask the question. Alderperson Bartlett?
Yeah, when I was on the Planning Commission, this came before us first, I think late last year, early this year, and we did ask that, and they said it was no change of use or any fiduciary, it's just for financial reasons. I completely understand if you want to abstain until they come and answer your questions, but I'm comfortable with voting in support of it. But.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed and abstentions?
Yes.
Okay, 1 abstention. That motion carries. And that takes us to R-119, 2019, Alderperson Caravello.
R-119, 2019, resolution by the Common Council of the City of Stoughton conditionally approving the preliminary plat for Hamilton Street condominiums. Plan Commission recommends approval by a vote of 7-0, and I so move.
Second.
Second by President Majewski. Alderperson Caravello.
I think this was pretty straightforward, returning this back to condominium as opposed to rental apartments. And there was only one question about addressing drainage adjacent to this property that, where is that on here?
So along the east side of the property, there's a drainage easement that traverses the east side of this property. And then that will be maintained.
Any other questions or comments, or Alderperson Hirsch?
If they switch over from apartments to condominiums, what happens to the people that are living there right now? I mean, are they just, if they can't afford the condo, are they just let go? I mean, we know what happens, what their plan is. And just how many, that's a lot of families that
Director
are
Shield?
displaced.
I anticipate they have leases that are subject to renewal, and they may try to honor those. This building was originally constructed with the intentions of being a condominium, and you might recall this particular foundation sat idle for a period of time before when the market crashed. This property owner took it over and created it as a residential apartment complex to begin with. Now they're bringing it back to the original intent that it was originally submitted as a condominium with separate ownership of each dwelling unit.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed, that carries. R120, 2019 comes from Public Works, Alderperson Bartlett.
Bringing forth Resolution 120 of 2019, authorizing and directing the proper city officials to adopt an updated building use policy. And so moved.
Second.
Second by Alderperson Riley. Alderperson Bartlett.
I got to ask Director Shield to cover this as he drafted some of this here.
Actually, I was involved in the drafting. You can see that the principal reason for the change was the relocation of the city administration to the new facility, the renaming of the Opera House to the Opera House facility, and acknowledging there's still public rooms in that facility that would be available. I will note there's one spelling correction on page 2 that came out of the Public Works Committee. It was a statement to say that the use by the rooms for government users with staffed. It was not staffed. In here on page 2 it says staff. In other words, there's a staff person that's intended to be present during those governmental user activities. So under users, under governmental users, there's a sentence that indicates and are under the control of that body and is staffed by a city employee. That was added by the Public Works Committee.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just kind of walk us through a little bit of what the Opera House building, the transition plan is for that.
The transition plan, are you speaking about the meeting spaces or?
Meeting spaces and the keys and the access and
All right.
the doors and.
Yeah.
Because everyone here will be affected at some point.
Yeah, we're undergoing an electronic door conversion right now to help facilitate meeting access to that building with better evening access, utilizing the front doors and the elevator during those public meetings. So we'll still issue notices and the like, and we'll control those meeting schedules and the door schedule through our office to help facilitate the rental opportunities of that space. When it's rented by non-government users, then there is a need for going through this building use policy, and there are fees associated with that and monitoring of the facility. Those of you that have been in and I'm sure all of you have, but recognize the complexities of that building and keeping people in a specific area or knowing where the people are within the building is paramount, because there's a lot of security issues that would be opened up if that wasn't a monitored space. So governmental meetings where it's staffed by a city employee, that city employee is providing the oversight and care for that facility and the ability to lock it down if necessary. In a rental situation, there's a hired person that would serve that role and monitor the space during that use.
And I would just add, we tried to look for ways to make that building more accessible for public usage. And it's, given the layout of the building, it was just really difficult to do while preserving the integrity of the building and the components of the building. So for some of the groups, we're encouraging them, they'll have to make other arrangements with the library or with some of the businesses if they want to use it for free. We would have liked to have the opportunity to do that there, but really what this policy says is, we really feel that the meetings that occur there or events have to be supervised, and so we tried to capture that and make it at least as cost effective as it could be for those that want to take advantage of that. Alderperson Hirsch, is that?
I'm trying to, my computer's not coordinating with me, but let me pull it up again. The fees, if I remember right, when this was first approved a couple of years ago, there was a number of nonprofits and community groups that were really up in arms because the fees now were too much for them to be able to afford using these community spaces, and there really isn't, private places that have meeting rooms. I mean, we thought that the hotel that was going up was going to have different meeting rooms, but they kind of nixed that. There really isn't any downtown businesses that has rooms available for people like Girl Scout troops, Boy Scout troops. I mean, some meet at the youth center, but there was a number of groups that lost their ability to meet in our facilities, and then the cost was way too much. I mean, it costs almost, my computer's just doing all different things on me. Yeah. It'd be $15 per hour, but then you also have to pay, there's other fees associated with that. Don't you have to pay, half hour before and a half hour after? So it's actually really, if you have an hour meeting, that's actually $30 as opposed to 15. I mean, it really, I'm glad that this came up because I think it's time that we really, look at those fees. And I mean, I understand about, wanting to protect those areas. I know it, at the fire station, there's somebody that's already there that we don't have to pay for. Same with the EMS building. I mean, downstairs in the old city hall. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to figure out how we can make those more accessible to other community groups that can't afford, to pay to rent it.
Sure. Director Shield.
If I can just clarify, the EMS facility and the fire department training facility are not staffed in the evenings and therefore are subject to the rental fee structure. The fee structure that's in here was not modified as part of this update.
Yeah. And if somebody wants to use the Opera House building, it's possible that there will be staff there at night on some nights, but, really, I mean, we have, for example, the Hall of Fame room. There's valuable pictures and things down there. We really want to make sure that, we'd like to leave it as the Hall of Fame room. If we're going to, we need to make sure that the contents are protected. And it's kind of hard for somebody that might be on the third floor to supervise that. So, we're certainly, can continue the discussion, but until we do, we have to have some sort of a policy. The Opera House building, the usage, I think, is Bill going to be the one that's going to be working on the calendar for that building?
You'll be the designated building manager, correct?
Or in the past, that usually went through City Hall and Rodney's department specifically for the bookings of the room. So there will be a slight change with that, but if it's a normal committee meeting, it'll be pretty much business as usual, except for you'll enter from Main Street door and go right to the downstairs. The upstairs door will actually be locked. the elevator will be programmed to only go downstairs. So that's what we're trying to do, to at least create a flow to go into the basement, because really, there's no reason to be anywhere else in the building. Go ahead.
With that said, it seems how this has been in this resolution with the fees and the limitations, it's been in effect for, what, a year and a half now? I want to know how many people actually have used these facilities. I mean, it used to be a lot, and I want to know if you guys are getting a lot of reservations now that you have, it's basically $30. You have an hour meeting, it's $30. So,
I have to tell you, I don't coordinate any of the reservations. The building managers for the different spaces, fire department training room is the fire department, EMS is the EMS, senior center deals with the senior center bookings.
but we must be getting some money in, so maybe Jamin can tell us if you've had any money coming in, which would tell us how many people are actually.
I would have to look. These types of fees aren't really on my radar, but I can go back and look it up.
But, I mean, have you seen any fees at all?
I don't collect the money, so I'd have to work with Lisa or Holly on this to see how these fees flow in.
So a follow-up question is, if somebody is reserving this, who's actually staffing them? Is it different EMS people, different fire chief people, Holly? Who's doing that?
The city has actually employs room observers, so these are people that actually come and just, make sure that the building is, that people stay within the room and that nothing happens to the building. So these are employees of the city that only observe the rooms. So they're part-time employees.
So do you know how many have actually been employed for the year and a half?
I want to say around 5. Well, 5 room observers. I don't know. We have 5 employees that do this. I don't know how many times they've done it.
Go ahead, Ben.
I had a question about the fees as well. Just the flat fee, $10 per use on the form. I don't see any, anything that corresponds to that in the policy, whether that should be added to the fee schedule. So is this $10 per use plus the hourly rate that we're talking about?
I'm not the sole author of this document, but we worked from the basis of the approved copy from 2015, really to incorporate the new facility, the addition of the Opera House rooms, which were not previously authorized to be used by the public. Those are now rentable, and in the past, they were not. So we can certainly follow up on the questions related to fees that we've taken in, and whether the fee structure schedule needs to be added to include that flat fee. Just can't speak to that at this point.
Any other questions or comments? Alderperson Hirsch?
Yeah, I mean, because it seems very extravagant, I guess I would get rid of the $10 fee, and, it's $15 per hour of the actual time that they're in that space. I mean, adding an extra $15 to them to actually have to pay for an extra hour every time they reserve, I don't think is really fair to our citizens. I mean, if you're going to say it's $15 an hour, that's really not true, because you're actually making them pay for an extra hour. So, the half hour before and a half hour afterwards. So it's actually $30 per an hour meeting, plus the extra 10. So it's $40 per 1 hour meeting. And for Girl Scouts, that's probably their, that's a big part of their budget. So, I mean, it's not, I don't think it's, I mean, I like what this ordinance did before was it got rid of all the private businesses that were taking up our meeting rooms, which I think is what started this ordinance, but what it did is it really killed the ability of our community groups to actually meet and to meet in a place. There is, like I said, there is no other private facility that they can go rent at this point that I know of that wouldn't cost hundreds of dollars. I mean, we don't have a Firefly coffee house like they do in Oregon that you can reserve it and have a meeting there. We don't have that. And libraries, 2 conference rooms are quite small. So if you have a bigger meeting.
There's Carnegie Room downstairs as well.
Yeah.
Alderperson Bartlett.
Yes, Holly, do you have any idea if we require the observers to show up 15 to 30 minutes early? Would that be why we would have the extra payment? So they can come and unlock the doors and check the rooms before the groups come? I wouldn't want to do away with it if, and so we would have to pay the observers to come early. Yes, that would be my only concern, making sure they're there on time and have time to adequately unlock everything and look at everything, make sure it's good before the groups come, but, yeah.
That's the intention.
Alderperson Schumacher.
May we postpone the vote on this one based on the policy and the fee schedule not quite matching up? As far as the flat fee, of whether that carries forward or not, until we have clarity on that point?
Where would we get the clarity from? Where would you send it?
Well, who started it?
Director Shield, you got an idea?
Well, it went through Public Works. I mean, the leadership recognized the issue, brought it to the Public Works Committee, who is the group that oversees the city buildings. Certainly, the flat fee is part of the application process that was approved. So whether that's enumerated in the policy per se, maybe that's material or not, but it is part of the adopted document, so either it can be cross-stricken or left in there, but that's how I would see it as being covered as part of the application process. I think it's important to highlight city leadership wasn't trying to penalize groups from using the facility. It was an acknowledgement of the need to secure the space and have somebody that is accountable during the time of somebody's rental. We've had experiences where that hasn't gone so well, when there wasn't somebody in charge of the space. Risk management saw this as being an important aspect of it, and that was part of why this was championing back in 2015 when this policy was updated at that time. So this is just an acknowledgement of that demand on someone's time to monitor the space, also document if something does go wrong, and how to facilitate a correction if necessary.
Alderperson Lagaki.
So perhaps a point of clarification then, that I see Public Works having done their job and clearly identifying these rooms that are available, but perhaps through the questioning of Alderperson Hirsch, we're discovering that we might have a community issue. The affairs of the community and costs and meeting rooms and accessibility, that perhaps we can bring this forward, but perhaps we send this to Community Affairs for further discussion of the potential costs and the employees who open these rooms and look at that matter. I think it allows this to go forward, but perhaps we've identified a new matter that maybe doesn't belong at Public Works.
We could certainly do that. I mean, if we want to approve this tonight and then continue the conversation about strategies for community use and how we can structure it to be more affordable, we can certainly look at that. And then see if we can come back with a recommendation if that's what you guys want to do.
I support Alder Lagaki's assertion here.
Okay. So we'll plan on doing that. Is there any more discussion on the motion?
So I found the revenue is $570 we've collected this year so far, and we've paid out $250.
What do you mean paid
That's
out?
labor costs.
For the room observers.
Okay. So, and we'll take that information to CACP as well. Any more conversation on the motion? Otherwise, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed, and then we'll take another look at it and on the fees and bring that back. That carries. Item number 10 is ordinance 22 is a first reading from Public Works. Alderperson Bartlett.
Ordinance 22 of 2019 is a first reading to amend section 10-35 electrical permits. And this is the first reading.
Anything you want to add to it?
This is, the state regulations have changed, and this is to bring us in line with the state regulations for electrical permits.
Okay. Any questions? Otherwise, this will be back in the August 13th meeting. And if something comes up between now and then, feel free to shoot Director Aber an email, and we'll try to get your answers. That takes us to item number 11, which is R 121 of 2019. And this is a document I think has been updated in an email that you might have received by Attorney Dragney. You want to walk us through this?
Yes. Let me just start with a little bit of history to put it in context. So the Kettle Park West Phase 2 development is something that was first presented to the city in the form of a preliminary plat back in 2016. And that preliminary plat was conditionally approved, and there was a certain amount of land area within that that was proposed to be dedicated for park purposes. The development has been proceeding in phases. There have been, I think, 2 final plats now approved, if I'm not mistaken, that allowed for the first plat that was, final plat that was approved allowed for the development of, among other things, the senior housing project that has gone up in Phase 2. Under the city's ordinances, when a housing component of a development, when there's a request for a building permit for that, there's a requirement to pay park improvement fees and fees in lieu of land dedication. If land dedication requirements haven't already been satisfied through park dedication. Here, the developer, at the time that building permit was applied for the senior housing, was in the process of redesigning the preliminary plat for the remainder of the area with the city. And so that the park dedication had not yet been accomplished. And so in order to preserve the opportunity to still accomplish the dedication of land for parks eventually, the city entered into an agreement with the party building the senior housing that said, you know, we're going to defer your obligation to pay these fees, essentially to create time so that we might get a land dedication instead. But we're going to, but the agreement we entered into said you don't get an occupancy permit if the fees aren't paid. That was kind of our hook to get paid. So that party is now getting very close to wanting an occupancy permit. But as you know, we aren't quite completed with the process of the approving changes to that overall preliminary plat and accomplishing a park dedication. That hasn't happened yet. So the request before you is to kick the can down the road a bit longer. The agreement included in your packet, and I apologize for the lateness of getting some revisions. I didn't have a chance to look at what the developer's attorney prepared until I'd looked at it. We had some conversation. He made some changes, but I had more work to do, which I did today. Where it is now, and I'd be happy to explain the few differences there are between what was in your packet and what I'm going to recommend you actually vote on tonight. The way this agreement is structured, it does a couple of things. One, the developer, Kettle Park West LLC, is assuming the obligation to pay the park improvement fees and the parkland fees and taking that obligation off the plate of the senior housing developer. So it's not their obligation to pay it under this agreement. Part one. Part two, this agreement says the park improvement fee which is approximately $60,000, is required to be paid by the end of July. 3, the obligation to pay the park land fee is being kicked down the road till the sooner of either the date on which the next final plat is approved for Kettle Park West, Phase 2, because by that time, presumably, we'll have the park issue figured out, and we'll get a dedication, or July, or let's see here, or July, let's see,
Says June 30th, 2020.
there you go. I just couldn't find it. There you go. So the sooner of those dates, if we don't have the park dedication accomplished by June 30, 2020, then Kettle Park West LLC would have the obligation to pay the park land fee. My question to the developer was, how are we going to secure the developer's obligation to pay this so we know we're going to be paid? And what was proposed and what is in the agreement is the original development agreement between the city and the KPW developer that provided for TIF funding had 2 different kinds of TIF funding that were provided for. One was the use of city money to pay for the installation of a lot of public improvements out there, and that's already been done, and we're receiving tax increment and paying our debt service on that, and that's not what this is about. There's another TIF aspect to that agreement which said that the developer was entitled, once they met certain conditions, to receive a municipal revenue obligation from the city, and this is basically a pay-go TIF component. You may have heard pay-as-you-go TIF, where the city would issue a municipal revenue obligation to the city saying, we will pay you, in this case it was $500,000, we will pay you $500,000, but that's payable solely out of tax increment that's generated by the project and that remains available after all of the other expenses are being paid. And so what they have proposed is to assign to the city their right to receive that municipal revenue obligation. And there is a proposed collateral assignment of that right attached to the agreement. And so if there is a default in terms of they failed to pay the land fee, the city would have the right to say, well, we are now going to start collecting on that $500,000 instead of you, and that's how we'll pay ourselves. Now, it's my understanding, and I'm glad Jamin is here, but it's my understanding that the TIF district in question is now generating enough tax increment on an annual basis to pay not only the existing city debt service obligations, but also to make payments on this municipal revenue obligation. So let me ask Jamin, is that correct?
That's correct. Off the top of my head, I don't know if we could pay the $550 immediately, but yes, the TIF district is able to service its debt and start paying on this.
Okay. So we could get paid eventually if we had to use that mechanism. Yeah. So that's the agreement that's in front of you. I think my understanding is, the way that we've been thinking about this at a staff level is that, again, it's just buying more time to create the opportunity or preserve the opportunity to have park land dedicated where we would like it as part of this development, because we'd like to have the land there rather than the money, which we would then have to use to go buy land somewhere else. And that would complicate the process of how we get this past the next step of dealing with the Kettle Park West project. So I'd be happy to address any questions.
Alderperson Reeves?
Can we vote on this since it wasn't in the packet that went out to the public?
Yes. What you have to decide, I mean, what I'm recommending is that you vote on the one that you got emailed to you tonight, not that was in the packet, because it has some revisions that I made today and that I ran by the developer's lawyer that I think are good revisions in terms of clarifying things in the agreement and protecting the city's interests. So if you're going to vote on it, I would vote on the one that you received in your email at the beginning of the meeting tonight, not the one that was in the packet.
The email is from me.
Yeah, you got an email from Holly at probably about 7 o'clock or 7:15 that has a red line draft of the agreement with the changes I made today. Let me mention from a timing standpoint, so I see Dennis Steinkraus is here. He may be, if there's a concern about acting tonight and wanting more time, if he has concerns about that, I'm sure he'll tell you what they are. I know they're kind of up against a deadline, I think, on the occupancy permit.
Well, then they should have got their shit together before.
Do you have a?
Well, yeah, the deadline is basically for the owners of the senior housing to get their occupancy permit, and you don't have another meeting before their required date. That they're hoping to get their occupancy permit by August 1st. If that works out that way too, because they've got to get inspection.
Is that the occupancy permit, is that an administrative function?
It is.
But we will not issue the occupancy permit if this agreement is not approved,
That's correct. We can't unless they make the payment.
unless they make the payment.
If they make the payment of the previous agreement, we potentially forego the opportunity to get parkland dedication for 100 units of dwelling units, for 100 dwelling units.
Did I see a hand up over here? Alderperson Hirsch?
Yeah, I guess I really have a big problem with us getting this in our email as we're meeting tonight and not having the proper time for us to properly review it. I appreciate your overview, but I really think it needs to go through finance. I don't like that we're doing this on the fly once again, and if this was a big deal, it should have been done, brought to us in plenty of time. It shouldn't be this, last minute sort of a thing. I don't know who's responsible for that and why it was so delayed and now we have to rush through it. I say that we send it to finance. I want us to thoroughly vet this and have time to think about it. I mean, this is really important. It's a lot of money and it's parkland, and we need to make sure that it's not, that it's done correctly. And that we're, make sure that, all the words are correct and, that it's just not a fly-by-night sort of a resolution. So I make a motion to table this and send it to finance.
I second.
So it'd be a motion, we postpone, okay?
Yeah.
All right. So there's a motion to postpone, set it to finance. I heard a second over here by Alderperson Legaki. And did you want to elaborate, or was that?
Oh, I think I pretty much elaborated.
All
Do
right.
you want me to elaborate more? I'm not Riley.
Well, of course you're not. You're not that articulate, sir.
Alderperson Riley did have his hand up, though.
Boy.
I have a question.
Oh,
and an
go ahead.
elaboration.
Sure.
What does it mean for the senior living not getting, does this mean that the senior living project will not get their occupancy permit, and what does this mean on their timing?
I can only speculate, but what the current agreement is, it says that they would have to cut us a check for the entire amount of property or cash before we could issue an occupancy permit, assuming other conditions are met on the construction, but and that would forego the opportunity to potentially get that amount of land for 100 dwelling units as part of the dedication of a future plat.
So the money would come from senior living or from Forward Development Group?
We don't care.
We don't know and we don't care.
Okay.
Just if I could speak to the timing issue. So this is something that the developer's attorney and I had a phone conversation about probably late June. He described conceptually what he had in mind. He sent me an agreement after we both got back from vacations that we took in late June, early July. I did review a draft from Dan probably 2 weeks ago and offered some comments and some requested revisions, which he sent to me, and I think I got last week sometime. But my schedule just kind of has blown up in the last couple of weeks, and I just could not get to it until, I didn't even know if I was going to get to it today, and I told those guys I'd do my best I could to review it today. So it's just one of those things where I think everyone did the best they could, but it wasn't possible to get it done last week, which would have been ideal, obviously.
Maybe, maybe you could just explain the changes that you made between the draft that they got in their packet and what we're looking at today. I don't think they're substantive.
If the council wants me to, I'd be happy to do that.
Did you have a question first, Jane?
Quick question, I don't know if Director Shield can answer it, but if we forego and send this back to finance for their concerted efforts to work with Attorney Dregney on this, is there any way that we can delay that payment?
That's what this agreement's attempting to do. I think the only way we can delay that payment is withhold issuance of the occupancy permit. Am I misinterpreting the question? Matt, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, we would withhold, the city would not issue the occupancy permit without being paid, and then it would really be up to the developer and Stoughton Holdings LLC, which is the senior housing developer, to decide what to do. And would they find a way to pay the impact fees so that an occupancy permit would be issued, or would they hold off for, 2 additional weeks to get through the August 13 council meeting?
I'm looking for a creative fix. Is there any way that we can issue occupancy permit that's not dependent on the payment of that rather large sum?
Not without violating the agreement we've already entered into.
Okay.
The council has basically told us this is how we're going to deal with that issue, so we wouldn't have the authority to do that at the staff level.
Thank you. Just looking for creativity.
I would
Contracts are more important.
I would anticipate a request for a special financing council meeting coming from the senior housing if this passes or is postponed.
Alderperson Riley.
Thank you, Mayor. Do we have any notion what the fiscal impact is with respect to the opening of the senior home or senior residential living? Is there potentially substantial negative fiscal impacts for want of the occupancy permit on the date that we're talking about here, July 31? Are they ready to go? Do we know? Are they ready to start leasing, et cetera? Yeah, do you, Rodney?
I can't necessarily speak to the fiscal. I can speak to my understanding of their need to obtain the city aspect of the occupancy permit that puts into motion a series of additional licensing reviews by other agencies because it's an assisted living facility. And that is dependent on issuance of the occupancy permit to begin that process. So it's, again, I can't speak to the exact timeline, but I know this is an important step in that process for them.
Thank you.
Alderperson Hiley.
Having reviewed this on the fly during the meeting, I don't see anything that substantially changes the terms of the agreement. I'm partly deferring to the attorney's status as the attorney in this, but I'm prepared to vote on this tonight.
Alderperson Riley.
Thank you. Just quickly for clarification, so I make sure that I understand. By entering into this agreement, are we in essence ultimately, at least by the design of the agreement, ending up with more parkland, and we're thinking that there's a greater value to that than the 62,000? Am I correct in that summary?
You're preserving the opportunity to end up with parkland within this development, more land within the development, because it'll be a dedication requirement that we use to get land instead of fees
to acquire,
to buy land.
Okay. And do we have any notion as to the value, the respective value of each of those?
I'm not current on, well, our understanding of whether our fees have kept pace with land values. Rodney might know better than I.
Do you have any thought on that? Is it okay?
They're evaluating the park fee ordinance right now, so I don't know where the market is
Okay,
on that.
thank you. All right, thanks.
You could safely say no, that
Yeah.
we're below.
The reason
Yeah,
we're
I'm sorry.
evaluating it is
Right.
because we believe it's low.
Okay, so right now, just so I'm clear on what the two of you are telling me, right now that 62 is a good deal for them. Parkland might be a better deal for us. Am I understanding that correctly? Thank you.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, I think they'd like to dedicate the parkland. I think it works for them for a variety of reasons that go beyond the dollars. I mean, in terms of how that development works. So I think it's probably more than just the money for them, but I think from the city standpoint, I think the city also would like the parkland.
Thank you.
The 62 is really that's the equipment fee.
That's right, that's
That's for the
improvement fee.
playground or whatever we
The
put
fee
in.
for the land
Shelter or
would be
whatever.
much more than that. And if we pay that, then we don't have to dedicate parkland.
Right, thank you.
Which we don't want. I guess I'm just frustrated that once again, our development group comes at the very last minute.
It's not, we weren't here the last minute. We've been talking to the city
I
for
know,
quite a
but
while
we
on
get
this.
the information the very last minute and we have to make a decision on the fly. This has happened over and over and over again with this. And I don't know who's responsible, but it's just, it's over and over with the same development.
Well, I think this one's a combination of things that have occurred throughout the last couple weeks. We've had the whole fence thing arose. That took up a lot of time. We've been working on things for the RDA, specifically the powerhouse. We've been working with other entities that potentially might want to do work in Stoughton. So it's been kind of the perfect storm. I don't know if I'd necessarily put this one on Forward Development Group. It's been a capacity issue on our end. Some of it we have to take responsibility for. Not that that makes it really any better. At the end of the day, you know, we had a document in the packet, and the one that was sent out tonight slightly differs, but really it's pretty much in the same spirit. But I certainly get your frustration. I've been on your side of the table as well, so I totally understand.
Yeah, because you're tying our hands, you know? Like, we want the parkland dedication, but if we don't pass this tonight, we don't get it. And so,
President Mayeski?
I'm in the same boat with Alder Hirsch. You know how I feel about things being brought at the last minute to council without due diligence for us to look at. Sadly, you know, parkland kind of trumps the deal. It would be kind of nice if the developer would say, you know, we've been pushing this down the road for you, allowing you to have this happen, that they would maybe throw in another acre or two.
Be nice.
Maybe that'll be an amendment to possibly consider before we vote on this. Little black.
Really? That's what it's gonna take? 1 acre? 2 acre, half an acre?
Anything you get.
Well, I don't know if we're really here to negotiate that.
No.
But
No,
certainly the point is well
I'm saying that in
taken.
jest, but the point of this is that Alder Hirsch is correct. You know, we've had this history where, for whatever reason, with this development, we always seem to be coming in at the last minute and the last hour of the last day. And it's just a statement.
So anyway, we do have a motion on the table, and the motion is to send this to finance. Is there any other questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, say aye. All opposed?
No.
Okay, so that leaves it here, so is there another motion, or what would you like to do?
I move to approve with Attorney Dragney's revisions.
Second.
A second by Alderperson Jensen. Any discussion on this? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed,
I'm
that carries.
abstaining.
Move to adjourn?
One abstention, did you get that? And I got a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second by Alderperson Hiley. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed, that carries. Thank you.
Thank you.